The Denver Broncos have finalized their 2024 NFL Undrafted Rookie Free Agent class. Sean Payton might have a joker in the deck. We'll tell you who that is on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you once again to everybody in Broncos Country, all the everydayers out there for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day every single day. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends Monopoly Go. I admit I have a competitive side and is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on a classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play Store. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantly orange.com. Make sure you subscribe or follow Locked on Broncos for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more. And on today's show, we're really going to dive into whether or not the Broncos roster right now is less suited for an undrafted rookie free agent in 2024, which UDFAs that the Broncos brought in might have the best chance to make the team. But we're going to kick things off by talking about the undrafted rookie free agent class following the 2024 NFL draft. Sayre, my friend, this is always one of the more exciting times after the NFL draft. There's the initial excitement with Denver's draft class, which we broke down on yesterday's episode of Locked on Broncos. But then everyone starts to look at undrafted rookie free agents. Who gets the biggest signing bonus? Denver's filling out their 90-man roster here. They added some players who are going to come in and compete at rookie minicamp in a couple of weeks. And more than likely, some guys are going to be at training camp when it's all said and done. And I think everyone's looking who could be the next undrafted gem here for the Denver Broncos.
Right, because the Broncos have a lot of those throughout the course of their franchise history. I mean, you could talk about maybe some all-time greats like obviously Rod Smith, or maybe some recent guys like, I don't know, Chris Harris Jr. Anybody ever heard of him there? So I know the Broncos, Cody, have a rich history and it goes deeper than just those two guys, but it feels like at least one guy every year is poised to find a way to make this roster. And so when you look at this group of undrafted free agents, it's like Sean Payton, we're all kind of like him. Remember what he said last year? You don't want to have these guys in your offseason program and let them go somewhere else and find great success, because you want to make sure that you identify that talent right away. I think this is a good group of undrafted players, some guys that, you got to do some research on to figure out, okay, what does this guy bring to the table? Who even is this guy? As is the case with every undrafted class. But I found it interesting. The Broncos didn't really go after a ton of super small school sleeper guys this year. Like, remember last year, we were all like Jalil McClain from Youngstown State. I mean, where the heck is this guy from? How did he sneak by leading the entire NCAA in career rushing yards? But I think you've got some players that could contend for this roster, even though it is going to be tough with all the talent the Broncos have brought in this offseason.
Yeah, and I think that's where our conversation is really going to shift here this week. I mean, obviously on the show and even today's episode, really trying to figure out what is the roster building vision now going forward post NFL draft. And I think when you look at this year's class, you do see some of the bigger schools. You got a couple of guys from Georgia Tech. I mean, you got a guy from Wyoming, you got a guy from Utah, you got a guy from, a couple of guys from Memphis, you got a couple of guys from Nebraska, and even a guy from Fresno State. These are all like typically bigger programs than what Denver's accustomed to going after an undrafted rookie free agency. But I feel like we should definitely highlight a couple of the names here. I think probably some of the more notable ones here. Memphis running back Blake Watson is a name to keep an eye on here for the Broncos. He's probably one of the top ones we'll talk about a little bit later on here in today's episode show in terms of making the roster. You look at some other guys here as well, up the street a little bit. Well, not up the street, but a little bit up north. You have Frank Crum from Wyoming. He's an offensive tackle. And then you have a couple of guys from Nebraska, and specifically cornerback Quentin Newsome. Like Denver, they've added a couple linebackers, one edge rusher, a couple of defensive linemen, a couple tight ends. But for the most part, like I feel like where Denver's roster is at right now, these guys are going to have a little bit of a road to come in and really try to make some hay to compete for a roster spot. But maybe in addition, I want to throw into maybe analyzing these UDFAs here. And obviously fans are going to have to go and research some of these guys themselves. But the reality is like they also brought in Cody Roark this offseason. And one thing that Sean talked about specifically was he's got a great background, specifically even after the NFL draft with looking at undrafted rookie free agents. And obviously when they were in New Orleans together, he was a big part of their success in finding UDFAs. Sean Payton's had a history of UDFAs as well. We saw it last year with Denver. Heck, there are a handful of guys. I mean, Alex Palczewski made the undrafted rookie free agent list in terms of the 53-man roster. You had Jalil McClain, who made it as well. And then you had, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't it Thomas?
Nate Atkins.
Nate Atkins. And then it wasn't Thomas Incoom. Who's the other edge rusher here that I'm thinking of? I'm literally spacing it here as we're doing the show.
I'm spacing it as well. I have the depth chart pulled up right now, but I don't remember last year. We'll have to do some research and development on that one, Cody. But I mean, there was a few, and it was a sign of both where the Broncos roster was at, but also I think, look, as rich as the Broncos history is of bringing in undrafted free agents, it's kind of Sean Payton's thing as well. I mean, over the course of his time with the New Orleans Saints, they have a rich tradition and history of finding undrafted players. Even the Broncos have brought in a few of those guys as free agents this offseason at hey, this was an undrafted find for Sean Payton in New Orleans. We're bringing him to Denver now. And I just think you go all the way back to somebody like Tony Romo, right? That was Sean Payton's guy. I mean, from the same alma mater. And I think just that's something that these guys take pride in. When you start to find a streak of these players, and when you start to say, all right, we're not going to let the good ones out of the building, I think they kind of start to get on a little heat streak, like a heat check, sort of thing, where they almost want these undrafted guys to come in and steal somebody's job because they've been so good at finding through the years. So I think it's not just a Denver Broncos thing, it's a Sean Payton thing as well. Two of the best in terms of the last 20, 30 years of bringing in undrafted guys. You can't really ask for a better formula between these two programs. The Broncos having success, Sean Payton having success. I think that even though it's going to be tough, Cody, I might put my money on an undrafted player, at least one of them finding a way to crack this team.
Well, which undrafted players for the Broncos in this year's undrafted rookie class have the best opportunity or could be in the best position to make the roster going into training camp and into next season? Well, that's something we're going to break down here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country, today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at Monopoly Go. All right, game off. We got to pause here to talk about Monopoly Go, and I know what you're saying. Flag on the play. Cody, you've already talked about that. You've been talking about that, but there's just so much good stuff that's going on in this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for time tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. And there's so much to get, like unique stickers that you can trade with friends to complete albums for big prizes. They have cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with, plus hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go, it feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges, and a ton include their own unique mini games like digging for treasure or a robot pachinko machine. And there's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench and go download it now for free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on with Monopoly Go.
We could see another sleeper at the running back position make the Denver Broncos final roster after going undrafted in 2024. We're going to talk about Blake Watson and maybe some of these other options the Denver Broncos have to crack the 53-man roster despite not getting picked. But we want to say thank you to every single one of you that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. And shout out to all of you everydayers that made the NFL draft weekend so special for Cody and I, especially if you subscribe and listen every day or watch on YouTube, where we know we've got a lot of new viewers and listeners over the course of the weekend. So mile high salute to every single one of you that listens free and available everywhere that you get your podcasts, or if you're subscribed to the YouTube channel. And Cody, let's break down some of these sleepers here, because you mentioned Blake Watson at the top. I really liked watching this guy. The Broncos brought him in for a top 30 visit, so kind of got to do a little bit of research before he signed as an undrafted player. I thought they might double up in the draft itself by taking him somewhere, either in the 6th or 7th round. Ultimately, he goes undrafted. He's a former wide receiver from Old Dominion who transitioned to the running back position. He's got some serious pass catching chops, 113 catches in his collegiate career, but really started to emerge as a running back late, and he did so at Memphis. So I think this is a guy who had draftable grades. He's got big time speed. He's explosive. He can catch passes. Let's talk about why we like this guy's chances to maybe make this Broncos roster in 2024.
Yeah, Sarah, I think when you look at Watson and maybe his fit here with the Broncos, like it is a crowded running back room right now. When you look at Javonte Williams, Samaje Perine, Jalil McLaughlin, you add Audric Estime to the mix, and now Blake Watson's going to come in. He's going to compete. Tyler Beatty's also on the roster as well. I forgot about him. They have a lot of options there. But I think when you look at like his utilization at Memphis, I mean, he's kind of an all-around scrimmage type guy, can impact you in the receiving game, can impact you in the rushing department. Like that's important for Sean Payton. How much did we see last year? Like the emphasis, like Sean talked about it. What was it? I think during OTAs or mandatory minicamp, he talked about Greg Dulcich in the Joker role. We never really saw him even do that in training camp. Like he struggled to get reps with the first team in training camp. And then he got hurt in week 1. And all of a sudden we're like, okay, we're not going to see the Joker role for Sean Payton's offense in 2023. And then they tried to make Jalil that. Like even Sean hinted at the end of the season, we want to make Jalil a little bit more of that Joker. But I mean, you could only do so much with only like 1 or 2 games remaining. And I think Jalil also got hurt in the final game against the Las Vegas Raiders. I think he got a concussion, if I'm not mistaken. So you bring in a guy like Watson, who's going to have an opportunity to compete. But the question is, who's he competing with? Like, in my opinion, I look at more of this move of Watson coming in. Does it have anything to do with Javonte? I don't think so. Audric Estime is obviously a big piece of what Denver wants to do going forward. Jalil McLaughlin, is he going to have to compete for a spot? I know how much Sean Payton likes him. So part of me is like, I'm not even factoring Jalil into this conversation. Part of me feels like, okay, Blake Watson, if he's going to upend anybody, it may be Samaje Perine.
Yeah, it kind of feels that way, doesn't it? Especially when you bring in the bigger back like Estime in the draft. So that kind of sends signals where, I mean, we know Javonte and Perine, they're both in the final year of their contracts respectively. And so maybe the Broncos are going to be doing a little bit of future evaluation when it comes to the offseason program here and saying, all right, which guys are really going to be around beyond this season? And you kind of have to give the edge to Javonte at that point, right? Don't you? Because, I mean, he was the team's featured offensive player last year, led the team in total touches. And I think they're probably banking a little bit on him getting back to form after sort of, just kind of, I don't want to say putzing his way through last year because that would be unfair to him in the miraculous way that he came back. But it was really tough sledding for Javonte last year. So I think there is a bit more to maybe the Samaje idea, even as good of a pass catcher as he was. I think the Broncos probably believe Javonte can handle quite a bit of that load there. So the running back position, where last year we were wondering, does the team even have 3 guys to keep, going into training camp to, now we've got 5, 6 guys that could potentially vie for actual NFL roster spots. So that's going to be fun to watch. A guy that I really like on this undrafted crop, Cody, is a sleeper named Thomas Yasmin. Okay, let's talk about this guy for a bit. Australian-born rugby player, 6'5", around 250 pounds or so, still kind of getting acclimated to the game of football. But I mean, you watch some of his 2022 stuff at Utah, he had only 13 catches, 6 of them went for touchdowns. And so it's a big play guy. I mean, he get the ball in space and he could race all the way to the end zone no matter what. I think he averaged over 23 yards a catch in 2022 at Utah. Unfortunately had an injury last year that ended up kind of crippling what could have been a potential breakout season amongst all these other guys that Utah's bringing into the NFL. When we talk about the Broncos at tight end, right now, everybody's kind of thinking, okay, if there's anywhere they're going to sign a free agent like veteran, it's going to be tight end. I don't know. Maybe Thomas Yasmin is a name to pay attention to.
It could be. And I also think Denver, because I think one Broncos Country listener brought this up and said, what do you think about Denver not adding a tight end in the NFL draft? And part of me said, okay, well, maybe they are going to go like trying to see if they can run it back with the tight end room as it is right now, and then maybe focus on that in next year's NFL draft, considering, they have a quarterback now, and they're very confident that they added a wide receiver in Troy Franklin. And obviously there's a lot of questions coming up about the future of Greg Dulcich beyond this year. Yasmin, I think the one thing too, and Lance Zierlein of the NFL.com, I thought did a really good job kind of piecing some things together. Like he has athletic traits. Like he talked about it specifically in his draft bio that he believes that Yasmin is a guy who needs to become a priority free agent, which the Broncos have signed him now as a priority free agent. Not a great route runner, has to polish up on that a little bit. But I mean, you talk about a guy who's very, very athletic. You can do certain things with guys who are athletic. But part of me is also wondering how that fits the mold, because I know when watching Sean Payton in Friday's practices, when they go on routes on air, he is so specific on how they run routes. And I just remember one practice, him absolutely chewing Lucas Kroll out for not running the route to the point of, I think bending it at a certain degree at like 13 or 14 yards. So for a guy who struggles as a route runner, what can the Broncos work with? And more importantly, can he come in and can he compete with Nate Adkins, who obviously won a roster spot last year? This is, I think, one of those things you're going to have a little bit of fun with, maybe during rookie minicamp, maybe going into training camp a little bit. But is he going to be a guy that sticks? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. And I think maybe a guy who could stick that we are going to talk about here as Denver looks to address maybe some of the questions they have in the future. Wyoming offensive tackle Frank Crum, just up the road a little bit from Dove Valley. I'm kidding. A little bit of ways away, but still closer than most schools and obviously some of the players that Denver brought in. Very athletic offensive tackle at the NFL Combine. I think in terms of his athletic score, he was the third-ranked offensive tackle in terms of some of the metrics he put together. But he's also very experienced as well in terms of playing tackle. Obviously, a long-term starter there for Wyoming. He has a chance to be a great developmental prospect, in my opinion. But the question is, can he come in and maybe beat out a guy like Demontre Jacobs and Alex Palczewski, two undrafted rookie free agent tackles, one that made the active roster last year, one that was on the practice squad. Both have a lot of good favor inside the Broncos building and have a year of experience knowing what Sean Payton wants. So that's the only obstacle I would see here for a guy like Frank Crum coming into the mix.
Yeah, he's a big dude, like you mentioned, with athletic traits off the charts. I mean, he's one of those guys that scored close to a 10 in the RAS scale, and he's got, 6'8" frame, 34.25-inch arms. He had started 36 games at right tackle, became a first-team all-conference player at left tackle this past year. So I know he was draftable according to a lot of the experts out there.
Sixth round grade.
So the Broncos, they worked hard to get him into the building. You can't help but feel like he's kind of an add-on to this draft class a little bit. Just like Blake Watson, I feel like Frank Crum is in that mix as a, maybe, I guess, call him a 7th-round pick if you want to. I know he wasn't literally a 7th-rounder, but in terms of his talent, in terms of the projection, in terms of the fact the Broncos haven't drafted a tackle since Garrett Bowles in 2017, kind of hope that Frank Crum will stick, because you need those developmental players. If it's Demontre, if it's Palczewski, if it's Crum, I don't care how the Broncos do it. Would love to see them be able to keep some of these guys and develop them under offensive line coach Zach Strief.
We'll see if that's in the works here for the Broncos in terms of their developmental strategy, specifically at offensive tackle going forward, with Garrett Bowles' long-term future really up in question here for Denver. Is an undrafted guy going to come in at some point and maybe step into that left tackle spot in 2025 if Denver doesn't extend him? Like, that's a huge question. And look, Broncos country, we've had a lot of questions, going into this offseason. But one of the questions we have now after the NFL draft, start to ask ourselves, is Denver's roster less suited for an undrafted rookie free agent to make the team right now than they have been in prior years? That's something we'll debate and discuss on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. And as you all know, at Broncos Country, FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. And right now is the perfect time to get in on the action, because it is a playoff frenzy. From the NBA playoffs to the NHL playoffs, baseball season is in full swing right now, and you can get in on the action courtesy of FanDuel Sportsbook. And right now, new customers, they get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 whether you win or whether you lose. You can bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. You can choose money lines, you can choose point spreads, or you can even go into parlays where you can even do player stat projections. If you believe Nikola Jokic in the NBA playoffs is going to continue to get triple doubles, well, you can put money on there at FanDuel Sportsbook. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. As we jump to the fourth quarter action on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, we're going to ask the question, are the Broncos less suited right now to have an undrafted rookie free agent make their roster after NFL free agency and after the NFL draft with the moves that they have made? Real quick, we just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day every single day. And a special shout out to all the everydayers out there at Broncos Country. And if you're a brand new listener or viewer of the show, you found us after the NFL draft, we just want to say thank you so much for your time. We hope you stick around because we're going to have you covered every single day all year long on all things Denver Broncos related from an objective point of view. No doom and gloom, no hot takes, no clickbait. We're just going to break it down and talk about what it could be, what it may not be. We're going to look at all that and much more on Locked On Broncos here. Sayre, I think this is an interesting question because I kind of got the vibe. You know, you and I, we talked about Frank Crum. We talked about Blake Watson. We talked about Thomas Yasmin, a couple of guys we feel like out of this year's undrafted rookie free agent class that we feel like could potentially have a chance to make the roster. I don't necessarily feel as convicted this year about Denver having an undrafted rookie free agent make the 53-man roster, at least right now in this early stage, right before we get to training camp. Once again, rookie mini camp's going to be in 2 weeks. I'll be there. Last year, I had a chance to look at guys like Jalil McClain. I had a chance to look at Nate Adkins, and we came back here on Lockdown Broncos and said, hey, Sayre, like these two guys really stood out, and what happened? They made the 53-man roster. I'm wondering if anyone's going to catch my eye this year, and we'll see. Like, there's obviously a lot that goes into the evaluation process here for Sean Payton and his coaching staff. But I feel like with what Denver's done in free agency, what they've done in the NFL draft, I don't think it's necessarily as much of a reality that Denver's going to have an undrafted rookie free agent and make the 53-man roster this year, despite the history that the team has had over the course of the last few years. And maybe even throw a question out there. Has that been an issue for Denver that they've had a lot of these undrafted rookie free agents make the team? Is that an indictment on overall their roster building in the last couple of years? Like, that's also another question to throw out there.
I think that's possible. I mean, on the one hand, you look at it as, well, they've been great at developing these undrafted guys. On the other hand, like you said, I mean, it could be perceived more as, well, shoot, they don't have a good enough roster. They've got to keep these undrafted guys. And that kind of has been an issue, you're right, with the Broncos suffering a lot of injuries in recent years. Obviously not last year, as we know, they went from dead last in the league in terms of the guys spending time on IR to number one in the league in the least. So
we know Bo.
We know Bo. Yeah, Bo. Hey, great job. And look, when you have guys getting injured, of course, you're going to have to call upon practice squad players. And that's where you're trying to stash these undrafted guys and hope that, man, over time they could develop into contributors, not necessarily thinking, hey, every undrafted player is going to be Tony Romo or Rod Smith or whoever. You don't necessarily bank on that kind of a thing, but shoot, I mean, if a guy is outplaying his draft status, you get a Shaquille Barrett type who's coming out there looking like one of the best edge guys in the league at one point. Remember for the Bucks when he had like 19 sacks or something like that. I mean, yeah, those are the types of guys that you want to leave on the field. But if guys are just playing because they have to, now that's a way different story. But then you have guys like Tim Patrick who just over time, man, he just keeps making plays. He keeps forcing his way onto the field. He has 0 drops in 2021. You want those types of stories. You don't want to necessarily continually be having the replacements out there on the field at all times. And with the Broncos' Moneyball approach to the offseason, you kind of get the impression that it is going to be a little bit tougher for these undrafted players to crack this team.
Well, and especially I think when we did talk about Watson, but it's just like when you look at what Jalil McClain was able to do last year, consistently in rookie minicamp, OTAs, training camp, preseason, and on top of that, when he got in on the regular season, like Jalil was one of the more exciting players for the Broncos last season. And at sometimes like teams began to adjust to it a little bit. There were some up and downs with that. But I mean, ideally, you look at his talent and what he can do. He's a fun player to watch. He's explosive. And Denver didn't have a lot of explosiveness last year, really outside of Marvin Mims in the return game, a couple of passes downfield, and then Jalil McClain getting to the outside and running for a big 40-yard gain. Like, we didn't see a lot of that from Denver's offense. So for me, I think Denver has been in a position in the past couple of years where they've had to rely on undrafted guys, you know, as you mentioned, in certain situations due to injuries, but they've also had a couple of guys contribute just because they earned it. They worked hard and they were producing and they were playing better than some of the guys who even had draft status or free agent status in terms of being signed to the team. There is a chance. And look, this is the game. This is what I love about football, Sayre, is you can bring anybody in. Doesn't matter if you're drafted first round. Doesn't matter if you're an undrafted guy. What you do on the field when you get those opportunities is all that really matters. And that's what Sean Payton, his coaching staff, that's what they're looking for. And I remember Sean as well telling us, you know, when you look at some of these guys, what they're doing, you try not to get too excited about it, right? Because there's no pads on yet. And then when training camp comes around, it's like, okay, hey, there's pads on, but can he do this in a game against other competition? You're not going against the same guys every day. Like there's so much that's going to factor into how they're going to view this roster specifically, but also for these young guys that are vying for a roster spot, that's huge. And on top of that, we also know maybe in the next year or two, the NFL is exploring eliminating another preseason game, adding another regular season game, which makes, I think, opportunities for these guys who are undrafted a little bit more difficult to make it to the NFL. However, I also think it opens up the opportunities for Denver to not have as much intel on some of their top guys that they may like that are undrafted that they want to develop a little bit more. You don't let a lot of that intel get out if you don't have as many preseason games. So there's a lot of bittersweet components to it. Overall, I just feel like this is a year we may not see Denver have an undrafted rookie free agent make the roster, at least right now on paper. That could change.
Which I think obviously is a good thing for the Denver Broncos, right? I mean, if you don't have an undrafted free agent make it, that's not an indictment necessarily on your ability to evaluate these players. It's really more of a case of, hey, the roster's just too good for these guys to come in. And look, we're not sitting here in April, at the end of April, beginning of May, saying, look, the Broncos roster is so good they can't have an undrafted free agent make it. But that's the hope, right? That you brought in all these free agents, you brought in all these guys to come and play. You have, a first round quarterback. You really hope that your player development has been on point enough to the point that, look, we don't have room for even the top guys that we signed as undrafted free agents. Or maybe it would be nice for a change to kind of have it sting a little bit. Some team steals a guy that you put on the waiver wire. Like, man, that's a good player that we just lost. The Broncos haven't really been in that position for quite some time, it feels like. And so it's almost like it would be a nice thing to shift to that right there, as opposed to being like, all right, who are we going to pick up off waivers? That's going to have to be a significant contributor to this team. It just feels like things have shifted now with Payton bringing in so many more of his guys.
Well, we're excited to see how things are going to pan out here for the Broncos. Look, Broncos Country, we've been very firm on the record saying we feel like Denver came away relatively well in the NFL draft with some of the team building prospects that they kind of put together there. Some of the guys that they've brought in to help set the foundation to build around Bo Nix. On paper, we believed it's a home run, but the results are going to have to show themselves. Like, we're not going to deal in absolutes. On paper, it looks good. Can they prove us right in terms of our thought process and our analysis? So much is going to be contingent upon how those results kind of play out during training camp, preseason, and obviously into the NFL regular season here. But Broncos Country, we have a lot to talk about this week, going into next week, so on and so forth. We're going to focus on every single individual draft pick that the Denver Broncos have. And we're going to kick things off really with tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos, highlighting and focusing a little bit deeper on Bo Nix. What does he have to do to be the starter day one? Are the Broncos in a position where Bo can thrive immediately as a rookie? That's something we'll debate and discuss on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.